We are moving beyond the Baroque into a kind of triplet of different genres. The Rococo, Neoclassicism, and Romanticism, almost all of them having most of their roots in France. But let's kind of keep track of our timeline. And last time I said medieval for the style before the Renaissance, but it's really been it's also typically known as the Gothic. That's my fault. I apologize for that. So we've got Gothic, we've got Renaissance, and then we've got and then we had Baroque, which is our last era. Okay, and after Baroque is the Rococo movement, which we actually kind of see almost in parallel with it at times, right? And then after Rococo, we see the kind of dual genres of Neoclassicism and Romanticism, which kind of have a lot of the same ideals at hand, or at least especially when it comes to a focus on nation, right, and love of nation, especially in the wake of the French Revolution, but go about it in very, very different ways, right? So let's start with Rococo. They kind of compare Rococo to Baroque style with its kind of energy and its subject matter, right? But it's different. It's a little bit different in form and content. Different from Baroque in form and content. I'm sorry, I said its subject matter is the same, or they said they might be similar, but they're not. It's more of the way they paint them, right? The Rococo are celebrations of gaiety, romance, and frivolity of the grand life at court, right? It's not celebrity, celebration. Celebration of gaiety, of romance, and the frivolity at court. Frivolity of court life. Frivolity of court life. Okay. And especially the court at Versailles. Right. That was made by Louis XIV. And they also emphasized really lighthearted decoration. They emphasized lighthearted decoration with lots of golds and pastel colors. With gold and pastels. Pastels kind of being very bright and vibrant colors, right? And they talk about 3 different artists, and we're gonna start to get into this rhythm that the resource will have of usually mentioning 3 or so famous artists of the era. Right? We're gonna start with Jean-Antoine Watteau. Jean-Antoine Watteau was the leader of this generation of artists going from 1684 to 1721. Right. And he's the innovator of the new genre. So he's the leader of the new generation. He's also the inventor of the genre known as the fête galante. Inventor of the fête galante. What is the fête galante? Right. Well, generally, this is kind of a genre of painting. And it really emphasizes the nobility in contemporary dress, kind of hanging out in the countryside. Contemporary dress in enjoying leisure time in the countryside. Right. Another key artist of the Rococo period is Francois Boucher. Francois Boucher, who is a little bit younger, born 20 years or so afterwards, 1703 to 1770. Right. He is influenced by what they call Watteau's delicate style. And he becomes the favorite of Madame Pompadour. And she is the mistress to Louis XV, which means that they were not married, but they had a relationship. Right? The mistress of Louis XV, who is the last Louis before the French Revolution. His son, I suppose, I don't know if it's his son per se. There might be another name in there that's not Louis, but Louis the 16th will be the king during the French Revolution, right? And what he did is he would transform characters of classical myth into courtly gallantry, right? Scenes of myth into courtly gallantry, right? And then with an emphasis on nubile nudes. Okay, let's Google that. Let's Google through that nubile real quick. That means usually of a girl or young woman that is sexually attractive. So that's fun. And then lastly, our last of the three Rococos is Jean-Honoré Fragonard, or Fragonard. Jean-Honoré Fragonard. And he lived from 1732 to 1806. Okay. And he was also he was also a favorite of Madame Pompadour. But I would say if they were going to ask you, hey, who's the favorite of Madame Pompadour, it would be Boucher, because they do not explicitly say that he is the favorite, right? And he studied and was influenced by Boucher. Studied with and influenced by Boucher. All right. So yeah, that is Rococo. And let's move into our next our next genre, which is Neoclassicism. Actually, before we do that, we should, of course, look at some artworks of the Rococo era. Okay, so here is a painting by Jean-Antoine Watteau. So these are nobles kind of in this almost normal, or the nobles, but like in kind of countryside garb, hanging out, vibing in the countryside. This is a painting by Francois Boucher, right? So you can kind of see it as like these Greek myth figures, right, being portrayed in the kind of current, dress and the current style, right? And then lastly, here's another by Watteau, which is kind of just a general. This is the fête galante genre, right? This idea of kind of the nobles kind of chilling out in the rural areas, right? And then lastly, here is one by Fragonard, right? Which actually seems to have a little bit of maybe some chiaroscuro. Something actually I would say I feel like I see here, not necessarily in that one. Maybe not. This one though, like you can kind of see the brush strokes, which is interesting. That's more of like an impressionist thing from later on. But also like it kind of has this airy feel, almost this sfumato going on, which is what we saw in the Mona Lisa. I'm not going to say that's a trait of Rococo or anything, but it's just something I'm observing. Who knows? All right. So now let's get into Neoclassicism. Okay, so Neoclassicism. Let's underline Rococo while we're at it. So first off, we got to get the context of Neoclassicism, and the context is the French Revolution of 1789. So the French Revolution of 1789 brings great change throughout Europe, right? And creates the idea. So I'll write that. I was thinking about not writing it, but whatever. We'll keep the narrative going. Brings change to Europe, and specifically the change that it really brings is the idea of a democratic republic. France goes through a lot of iterations of what they want during the French Revolution. It is not nearly as clean cut as the American Revolution. Right, the American Revolution is just, hey, freedom from the British. The French Revolution is trying to get rid of a, millennium-old social structure, as well as the kind of the absolute monarchy of France. Right, they had an absolute monarchy. Originally, what the French Revolution wanted was a constitutional monarchy, where the king would split power with the parliament. But once we start to see the French Revolution start rolling, it becomes a lot more what they would consider extreme, right? And going for like extreme democracy and things like that, right? And so this also becomes very much reflected in the artwork, right? This idea of a democratic republic gets reflected in the artwork of the time, right? And so they are reviving, right? They are reviving interests in the Greek and Roman styles, right? reviving interest in Greek and Roman styles, because the Greeks and Romans were known for democracy and republic, right? The kind of political systems they attain to have or strive to have, right? So yeah, again, an attempt to harken back to democratic ideals of the classical era. Right, so it feels like the Renaissance almost went halfway on this, right? The Renaissance really harkened back to the Greek and Roman styles for art, but didn't really necessarily want to look at the democratic aspects of it, right? And so this style is Neoclassicism, right? It emerges, so Neoclassicism, which I'm going to shorten here to Neoclass, emerges in the decades before the Revolution. But the revolution is really what's going to give it its wings and let it spread, right? And it's also the reason it really emerges before is because it's fueled by Enlightenment philosophy, right? Which has been around for a little bit at this point, probably about a century on the whole, right? With John Locke writing during the English Civil War in the 1600s, right? And he's kind of one of the main people of the Enlightenment era. And so, yeah, this is a direct challenge to Rococo, right? Especially considering that the subjects of Rococo are the people that the Neoclassicist style is looking to undermine, right? Right, and the aristocracy, right? And it's epitomized. They talk about only two artists here. They talk about absolutely the most important, Jacques Louis David. Frankly, he is really the only person you hear mentioned with this genre for the most part. Of course, we will hear from another one here in a bit. He survived the French Revolution, so good for him. Not a lot of French revolutionaries survived the French Revolution, right? And so before we get into his artworks, right? So he joins the new government joins the new revolutionary government as the master of ceremonies. And they say the government. There are several governments of the French Revolution, culminating with Napoleon, which is almost the opposite of what they wanted. Master of ceremonies for revolutionary mass rallies. Again, his role as this kind of master of ceremonies and the fact that he survived is impressive. And later on, he'll become the dedicated painter to Napoleon. Right, Napoleon kind of showing that you can a very strong ruler can kind of co-opt a revolutionary fervor and appeal to if he's a populist, right? If he appeals to the people, right? And in this capacity, he painted large propagandistic canvases. Let's just call them propaganda canvases, right? Propaganda, right, is art used by a government to promote that government or a policy of that government, right? And as they point out, right, this is kind of undermining his revolutionary ideals of earlier, right? Although we do see Napoleon actually do change some things in France that would benefit the common man, especially when it comes to the relation between the state and the church, and then the role of nobles, right? And so they kind of point out that Jacques Louis David is almost the perfect example of the complicated relationship between artist and patron, right? Because at some point the artist has to get paid, right? And sometimes, especially if they're a neoclassicist, right, who is espousing these revolutionary ideals, right, the people with money are going to be the people they're trying to revolt against, right? Between patron and artist. We saw this last year as well in Francisco Goya, who was the court painter for one of the kings of Spain around the time of the French Revolution, actually. And so he really, but he started to believe in the French Revolution, and he tried to kind of paint those subjects into his art, which the king, of course, did not like. Right, so that led to some issues there. And the major artwork of Jacques Louis David, or at least the art that they want to point out here, is the Oath of the Horatii, which was made in 1784. So this is a bit ahead of the Revolution. We're actually going to look at another artwork of his that is, frankly, more popular. but we will get there when we get there. Which, for those of you who do not know, the Horatii are warriors of the Roman Empire, and then they have a clash with the Curiati during this time period, right? So yeah, the Horatii, the Horatians, and the Curiati or the Curatians are two groups of ancient Roman brothers who fight each other, and they're kind of a major legend of Roman history, right? So whether that's true or not, right, that's probably not, right? So that's his major artwork, again, according to the resource, but we will talk about another one here momentarily. And then the other person we want to talk about is another Frenchman. Again, all of these genres really getting their power here in France. Jean-Dominique Ingres. Sorry, there's no accent there. Who lives from 1780 to 1867. He is a pupil of David's. Right, he's one of his students, right? And they finally point out what neoclassic style is here. He shows these sharp outlines, right? So like this very a severe lack of things like sfumato and kind of like atmospheric changes, right? Unemotional figures, right? Unemotional figures. Geometric composition, right? So like kind of shaping their composition into these clear areas, right? And rational order as the hallmarks of the neoclassical style. Okay, and let's take a look at some of their art. All right. So again, here's our last Rococo. And here is one of Jacques-Louis David's paintings. I did not put the Oath of the Horatii in here because it is in the resource. This is Aristotle taking the poison that he has been condemned to take by the court of Athens. For those of you who don't know, in Socrates' apology, right, he represents himself in front of the Athenian Congress, and he is on charge for corrupting the youth and stuff like that. And basically, his death warrant was already written, but he has this huge philosophical treatise that's super important from there, written by Plato. Right, Plato recorded it because Socrates is going to die. He's condemned to death, and then at his death, he hosts a massive party. And then at the end of that massive party, he takes some hemlock and dies. Right, and so that is how he's executed. So here's Jacques-Louis David, again representing the revolutionary ideals of somebody like Socrates, right? Who not necessarily would have actually espoused democracy. He might have, right? But he's probably more of a Republican man. And in fact, Plato, his subject, right, or not his subject, his pupil, right, who learned from him, would actually believe in philosopher kings. So yeah. And then this is probably the most famous painting of Jacques-Louis David's. It is a portrait of Napoleon on the Alps, right? So this is the propaganda, right, that they brought up, right? He's trying to paint Napoleon in this great, this great perspective here. Okay. And then lastly, here is some painting from Ingres, right? Again, we have no emotion, very ordered, right? Very ordered portraiture. Looking him up, most of his stuff was portraiture. Very ordered portraiture. Not a lot of fluff, not a lot of fuzz going around, just very simple, very clean art, which is the style of the Neoclassicists, right? Again, as we see here, right, and especially compare it to the styles of Rococo, right? Rococo is almost like hazy and dreamlike, right? This is absolutely not dreamlike, right? It is presenting an image of a scene, you know. All right, so let's get into our final genre for the day. And that is Romanticism. So Romanticism probably lasts a little longer than we see Neoclassicism come out. In fact, Romanticism becomes the predominant artistic genre, not just in art, but especially in music for the 19th century, right? And so this kind of harkens back. This goes back to the emotional aspects of Baroque. Goes back to the kind of emotional subjects, right? The emotional emphasis of the Baroque era. Okay. And the difference, though, is that the subject matter is very different from Baroque, right? In the Baroque period, we didn't necessarily see a call to any political ideals, right? It was mostly just whoever paid a lot of times would determine the subject, although you did see, again, some kind of poor people being painted as well, right? And so they kind of set the lines here of Neoclassicist versus Romantic, which I'm actually going to put out here. They kind of have a like a tail of the tape kind of thing, right? Right. So they say Neoclassicist is emphasizes line, order, and a cool detachment, right? Kind of just like a detachment from anything going on around, right? It's very serious, right? Romantic painting is highly imaginative, right? And is characterized by what they call emotional and dream-like qualities, right? Okay. And so basically we see reason versus emotion, right, in these two art styles, right? And so we also see exotic or melodramatic elements, right? Um, exotic or melodramatic elements in romantic style art, right? And then used natural wonders as a lot of their inspiration, or even in the art itself, right? And the first man they point out here is Eugene Delacroix, which, if you participated last year in the year of healthcare, you might remember Eugene Delacroix. We studied one of his paintings, which was the lady in the portrait of the lady in the not the asylum per se, but the like kind of home for people with emotional issues. Excuse me, I dropped my tablet here. That's not good. Is everything okay? Everything looks good. All right. So they talked about Eugene Delacroix at the very beginning as like the main proponent of Romanticism, right? And then they talk about how his subjects really represent the Romantic era, the exotic themes, right, and foreign settings. Violence, animal violence, which kind of is supposed to represent, like, animals or humans are violent like animals, right? And historical subject matter. Okay. And then the other two artists who, again, they literally just mention here right at the end, and this is the real pattern, is like, here's these other artists. I'm sorry, I said Eugene Delacroix is the guy you should remember. No, it should be Theodore Jericho. Theodore Jericho had a full art piece in the last year, who only lived for not a very long time. Theodore Jericho and William Blake, who, when looking up William Blake's artwork, I was shocked to hear he was called a romantic. But we're going to take a look at him in some of his art and see if we can maybe pick out the romantic aspect of it. He is much older. I'm sorry, I put 1825. What am I doing? 1824. Okay, so let's take a look at the artwork of these romantic artists. So you might actually be very familiar with the artwork of Eugene Delacroix right here. This is a very famous revolutionary French painting, right? And again, it's not to say that like everything is fading away, right? We're still in 18th and 19th century European art, so you're still seeing strong subjects, right? We're not at the point where subjects are fading out, right? And it becomes much more abstract, right? You're still seeing subjects, but you're seeing like this very idealistic, thing. Lady Liberty kind of carrying the flag for France, right? And that's the revolutionary French flag, right? That is not the flag of France at the time, right? For Theodore Jericho, you might remember the Raft of the Medusa, which was talked about in the resource last year quite a bit. Again, a kind of historical subject matter aspect of Romanticism, right? And then William Blake. I hope I got the right William Blake. William Blake's got some interesting stuff going on. I don't know what to make of this, but this definitely feels like more impressionist, maybe. Not even necessarily impressionist, but very strange art. I like it a lot. Don't get me wrong. I like strange art. Strange art's good art. But yeah, I just don't see how it meshes with these two artists here. But maybe I need to do more research and figure out how he's a romantic. But the one thing I want to mention about Romanticism that they did not is this is also a heavily influenced by nationalism. Nationalism and Romanticism are going to go hand in hand. The idea of the love of nation, which is created in the wake of the French Revolution, right? Not just in France, but Europe-wide, right? Which really shows that Romanticism and Neoclassicism had a lot of the same ideas in common in terms of what they wanted their subjects to be or what they wanted to promote with their art, but the way that they brought it out was very, very different, right? We have again, we have this very active, very chaotic situation in Romanticism, right? A lot going on the painting, right? And then we have this very simple style in classical style, right? Or neoclassical, excuse me. So anyways, that's going to do it for this section. In the next section, we're going to start to kind of get into realism and impressionism, which is kind of our last non-19th century era arts, which in the late 19th century is where we really start to move into the really interesting aspects of this art style. But until then,